I was so excited. This was going to be the first embalming I'd ever seen. I had been working in funeral service for a few months by then, and I was halfway through my first semester of mortuary school, yet somehow had still never witnessed the preservation process. I grabbed my scrubs that dangled from the rack in the embalming room, which we abbreviated to the prep room, and hurried to the bathroom to pull them on. Not every funeral provider wears scrubs while embalming. Sometimes it just requires heavy personal protective equipment, but you were better safe than sorry wearing scrubs. Oh, and shoe covers. Couldn't forget the shoe covers if I wanted to preserve the pristine absence of blood on my sneakers. After having emerged from the bathroom and donned shoe covers, I pulled on my plastic face shield, a surgical apron, and a pair of extra small nylon gloves. Once I was properly dressed, my boss Carl, the owner and head funeral director, entered the prep room and headed for the fridge. It was just us two tonight. He wasn't wearing full PPE like I was, but I supposed he was used to embalming and wasn't afraid to be in the splash zone. He unlatched the heavy metal door and disappeared for a moment before wheeling out an occupied cot. The deceased person, the decedent, as we refer to them in the funeral industry, was thinly veiled by a sheet of clear plastic that protected the body from the dehydrating effects of refrigeration. Carl motioned me over and I helped him to unwrap the body that was clearly upwards of 250 pounds, before straining with him to lift the poor fellow onto the porcelain embalming table. It wasn't an easy feat, but the trick to transferring a body from a cot to the table was to get the decedent's rear end up and over the edge of the table first, and then the rest of the body came easily. It was clear upon inspection that the decedent had been autopsied, as the large, Y-shaped incision that is typical of an autopsied body was present. We gently rinsed and washed the body with soap and water. It was incredibly important to scrub gently, lest the skin slough off, which often happens after a few days of being dead. These occurrences are called skin slips. Once we finished bathing the body, Carl directed me to sit in a computer chair in the corner of the room. I may have been a mortuary student, but he didn't trust me enough for me to get my hands on the real stuff quite yet. I grabbed the chair and pulled it a little closer to the table so that I could see what was going on. Carl chose a pair of small, silver scissors to cut the thread that had sutured his Y incision shut for transport. The thread had been used to make a baseball stitch, giving his scar the puckered seam of a baseball. As the thread was cut, the heavy flesh flaps of skin and lumpy, yellow fat fell to the decedent's sides and his abdomen gaped open. "Whoa," I couldn't help but utter. Carl chuckled at my awe. He had been doing this for so many years, it must have been refreshing for him to witness someone watching this kind of work for the first time. I was fascinated and scooted closer, ever so slightly. Inside of his abdominal cavity sat a red plastic bag, which I knew from prior research was full of organs and viscera. I was amazed at how it all managed to fit in there. When my boss took the bag out, and plopped it onto a plastic sheet that lay on the ground next to him, the only thing left inside the man was a puddle of blood and other bodily fluids. All the things that had once kept him alive, standing, breathing, all those things had been chopped up and thrown in a plastic bag, and now he was empty. Carl was about to reach for a scalpel to make an incision at the base of the man's neck, when he did a double take at the inside of the body. He leaned in to look closer. I squinted my eyes and noticed the irregularity. There were little white patches lining the abdominal cavity, and they grew in clusters. I noticed a mighty stink emanating from the corpse. I had smelled the stink of death plenty of times, but this was something else entirely. Despite the odor, I moved in to get a closer look at what seemed to be bacterial growth. It wasn't until I actually got up and stood over the body that I noticed the patches were moving. "What the F?" I exclaimed. I may not have known much about embalming, but I was sure that wasn't anywhere close to normal. "Yes, that's curious. Wonder if they got samples of these at the lab." "Here, hand me one of those plastic bags over there," marveled Carl. I was frozen in place and made no move for the bags. He snapped his fingers in front of my face and I snapped out of my trance. I fetched a bag as Carl grabbed a scalpel and scraped off a bit off the white gunk, then he wiped the scalpel off inside of the plastic bag and sealed it shut. He handed it back to me and I set it on the steel countertop. Carl reached inside the abdomen, and his bare arm brushed against one of the splotches. The mass spread quickly to his arm at a much faster rate than any bacteria could have grown. The white blob separated into hundreds of thousands of little particles, and the growth began to emit a strange noise. It sounded kind of like TV static, soft at first, but then more loudly as other white patches gravitated toward Carl's arm. He yelped and tried to yank his arm back, but the mass of particles formed a bridge between his arm and the body. It stretched like melted cheese along with his movements. "Carl," I screamed, reaching out to help him, then thinking better of it. I didn't want this thing to spread to me. The particles snaked up his sleeves and up to his face, then they began to branch off into his nose, mouth, ears, and eyes. The static now sounded like a distant crowd, and I was able to pick out individual voices from the noise. Wait, voices? Carl's attempts to shriek were muted by the little white dots pouring into his throat, and I crept as close as I could without touching him as he fell to the ground and began to seize. I pulled out my phone to call 911 and had just pressed dial when I heard another quieter set of voices coming from behind me. I whirled around, tearing my eyes away from my boss, whose body was now swarming with white speckles. The sound was coming from the plastic bag, inside of which was the sample Carl had just scraped from the body. Slowly, I approached the counter where the bag lay. The sound grew louder as I got closer, and I stooped over to take a closer look at the bag's contents. The whiteness had separated into particles the way it had on Carl's arm, and all the tiny dots flitted around within the sealed plastic. I yanked open a drawer to my left and took out Carl's magnifying glass to examine the writhing mass in the bag and brought my face up close to the lens to see. People. Well, they looked almost like people. Hundreds, no, thousands of them. There may have been millions in total with the amount of patches that had been inside the dead man's body. I couldn't discern any facial features that would likely require a microscope. I could only just barely identify protrusions that looked like arms, legs, and heads. I dropped the magnifying glass and stumbled backward, falling hard on my ass. The cold, hard concrete floors were rather unforgiving on my tailbone. How was this possible? As far as I knew, bacteria and mold did not look like little people. What kind of infestation was this? They certainly didn't look like worms. Suddenly, the group of tiny voices came together and interrupted my thoughts. You must bring us to him. I stared at the bag incredulously. Did they just speak to me? In English? Bring us. Bring us, the group chanted over and over again. I glanced over my shoulder to see that Carl had gone still, but at least he was no longer covered in white. No, I can't, that's my boss, what are they doing to him? I managed to say, pulling myself together as best as I could. The voices whispered amongst themselves, then one tiny singular voice spoke up. I had to nearly press my ear against the bag to hear it. You must bring us to him, unless you'd rather us find another host. Your body seems healthy and viable. The voices laughed. I nearly shit my pants. I definitely was not interested in suffering the same fate as Carl, and I wasn't even sure if he was still alive. Part of me felt guilty, but the other part of me knew that Carl was too far gone, and better they have him than me. So, I brought them to him. Carl coughed and sputtered, but remained unconscious. Oh God, he was still alive. Wait, no. Why should I help you? Can you save him? We didn't come to this planet to negotiate, they said with finality. Then, the white particles started to gather at the seal of the bag, prying it open. I squealed and dropped the bag, watching helplessly as the small creatures funneled out of the plastic bag, formed a line to the other side of the room, and crawled onto and into Carl's face. And then there was silence, save for the sound of my rapid breathing and my heartbeat drumming in my ears. Carl's body lay slumped on the floor. After a few moments, my brain started to process what had just happened, and I began to cry hysterically. Some time passed before I heard the sirens approaching in the distance. I started to breathe a sigh of relief, but my breath caught in my throat as I saw Carl's body twitch. It started small with little finger spasms, then it escalated to intense, seizure-like convulsions. I screamed again and again until he finally stopped and was still again. Then he sat up. Carl blinked his unfocused eyes and turned to face me. I bit my tongue and my eyes bulged out of my skull in shock. He wheezed and moaned, then he managed to form words. Thanks, for nothing. I was speechless as he climbed to his feet, at first unsteadily, but he found his footing. Then, at a speed that was remarkable for a newly coordinated body, my infested friend bolted out the back door and off into the night. The cops arrived seconds later, and I told them everything. I don't think they believed me about the colony of aliens living inside of Carl, and controlling his body, but they did appreciate me pointing them in his direction. Unfortunately, they never did find him. I hadn't heard anything recently about Carl's disappearance, and I was distracted by how crazy things had gotten at work with the owner and head director gone. It wasn't until last night that I really had the chance to think little people again. We had an autopsy decedent come in and I unzipped the body bag to examine the toe tag. It was that smell again. I pulled the bag open wider, and as I did so, the body's transport stitches popped and the flesh fell open. Inside were hundreds of colonies of white patches. I hurriedly zipped the bag shut and thrust the cot into the refrigerator. I'm absolutely not embalming this guy myself, and I've tried to warn the other embalmers about what happened with Carl, but no one has believed me. I actually think they might make me take time off work due to my delusional rantings. But whomever ends up with their hands inside this body, I sure as hell hope they're wearing the right PPE. Thank you for watching. The link to the Reddit post are in the description below. And don't forget to like, comment and subscribe.